She sat on the ground holding a sign. One food equals one night, until a cowboy claimed her before the others. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Red Hollow was the kind of place men came to trade, drink, or to disappear. The ground was dry enough to crack and the color of rusted iron, and the wind carried more grit than breeze. The trading post, a single-level building with warped beams and a patched roof, sat angled toward the trough and corral like it had leaned that way for years. No one in town lingered outside without reason. But today, a half-circle of onlookers stood near the porch, some pretending to be busy, others not bothering. She stood apart from them by only a few steps, close to a stack of dented water barrels. Her feet were bare, the skin split at the heels, and the tops of her toes were caked with dirt and dry blood. The dress she wore had once been tanned buckskin, soft and close-fitting, but now it clung unevenly where the seams had burst. One tear ran down from her neckline across the side of her ribs, pulling open when she breathed. Another split showed skin low across her hip. She held a stick pressed up under her arm with a scrap of cloth tied across it. The letters uneven. One food equals one night with me. She kept her eyes down. Not shut, just low. Anyone could see the tension in the way she held her shoulders. Her breathing was shallow, not from shyness, but from not trusting what might happen if she drew attention. Men passing by slowed to read the cloth or look at her chest or legs, then moved on with side comments. Some scoffed as though it were funny. Others acted like they were measuring cost. None offered anything. Her name, unknown to anyone here, was Nayeli. She had walked for days after slipping away from a mining camp where a trader had offered liquor to the men guarding her. Hunger forced her to think of what to trade, and shame forced her not to speak it aloud. The sign was her only attempt to control any part of it. She didn't want to sell herself, but starving in a ditch out of town had started to feel closer than pride. Isaac Boone had no reason to be in Red Hollow longer than the time it took to buy what he needed. He lived alone on a patch of land 12 miles east where dry pasture and a shallow creek cut through a stretch of mesquite and rock. He rode in rarely, usually before most men were awake, and left without joining any talk. He had a habit of avoiding eyes and sticking to the edges. His dark hair was tied back at his neck with a strip of leather. He carried a faded cavalry scar across the left side of his throat that made some people stare without asking. His coat was thick wool, worn at the elbows, and his shirt sleeves were rolled due to the unseasonal heat. He'd come this morning to collect feed, needles, and enough salt and cornmeal to last until his next trip. His horse, Flint, was tied near the well, sides still damp from the ride-in. Isaac was tightening the saddle straps when he noticed the group of men clustered by the porch looking in one direction. He didn't care about half the talk in town, but quiet crowds usually meant trouble. He turned to leave, then saw the sign she was holding. His eyes stayed on the cloth only a moment, but the strain in her posture kept him from turning away. He didn't recognize her and knew from her bare feet and wounds she hadn't come in with any group. He remembered enough from before he stopped wearing uniform to recognize when someone was cornered without a wall around them. He crossed the street without calling out. Dust rose with each step, covering the hem of his coat. The onlookers moved back a little as he approached. He didn't look at them. His attention stayed on her, on the way her fingers clenched the wood and how her chin dipped when his shadow fell closer. One man to his left said, "You fixing to bid, Boone?" We were lining up fair. Isaac ignored him. He stopped in front of her, close, but not close enough to touch. From where he stood, he could see the bruising on her wrist and the hollowed shape of her cheeks. Sweat dampened her hairline, even in the cold. She still wouldn't lift her head. He reached out slowly, not for her arm, but for the stick she gripped. She tensed like someone bracing for a blow or a grab. He took the sign from her hands. She didn't fight, but every muscle in her arms tightened. He lowered the stick until it hit the ground. The cloth flipped over when it landed, face down in the dust. She stood still, chest rising and falling unevenly. Her hands dropped to her sides, then pulled the torn neckline together out of reflex. Someone behind Isaac snorted. "Mighty generous." You going to share, or are you taking her whole? Isaac turned his head enough to meet the speaker's eyes. He didn't move a hand toward his belt or raise his voice. The man looked away after half a second and muttered something about minding his own business. Isaac pulled off his coat. The cold hit his arms, raising goose flesh, but he didn't hesitate. He placed the coat around her shoulders without brushing her skin. She stiffened, unsure why he hadn't shoved or handled her. The coat was heavy and smelled faintly of smoke and horse. She pulled it tighter around herself, though her eyes stayed lowered. He picked up the burlap sack he'd set near the well, then nodded once toward his horse. He said only 2 words, "Come on." Not a command barked. More an instruction, said like he expected to be heard once. She hesitated. In her head, every step was a choice between 2 kinds of danger, one she could see and one she couldn't predict. He didn't reach for her. He didn't drag her. He just walked back toward Flint like he was done standing there. Every man watching expected her to stay frozen or for him to grab her. She waited a few breaths more, then followed, keeping the coat clutched to her collarbones. Her feet left small, uneven prints in the dirt. Isaac loaded the feed onto his saddle and tightened the strap. When she stopped beside the horse, she looked at the stirrup like she wasn't sure she was allowed to use it without paying first. He didn't lift her. He didn't grab her waist. He only stepped to the other side, placed his foot in the stirrup, and waited for her to climb up behind him if she chose. His main reason for taking her had nothing to do with charity. He knew exactly what would happen if he left her standing there. He had seen men in uniform do worse to women who had less of choice, and he'd walked away from those men years ago. He didn't believe in rescuing strangers, but he did believe in not leaving someone to be torn apart with an audience. Naeli's heart pounded hard enough she could feel it in her ears. She didn't know if he wanted her body or if he'd drop her further out and tell her to survive the rest alone. But the weight of the coat, the silence of his voice, and the fact he hadn't looked at her chest once made her climb up behind him. Her hands didn't touch him, but she held the back of the saddle horn and stared straight ahead. No one tried to stop them. Flint stepped forward and the dust covered their tracks quicker than the crowd dispersed. The sign lay in the street until the wind blew it against the water trough, words buried in the dirt. The road out of Red Hollow was little more than a wagon trail carved through scrub and sun-hardened clay. Flint's hooves kicked up dust with every step, the rise and fall of the land stretching out ahead in muted browns and gray brush. Isaac kept his posture steady in the saddle, hands loose on the reins, saying nothing as the town shrank behind them. The cold morning air bit at his arms now that his coat was gone, but he didn't reach back for it or glance at the woman riding behind him. Naeli sat stiff at first, her hands gripping the rear of the saddle, unsure how close she was allowed to be. Each jolt of the horse forced her knees against his hips, and every brush of contact made her tense in case he turned on her. After a while, she shifted, pulling the coat tighter around her chest. His scent, smoke, sweat, leather, clung to the fabric, unfamiliar but not rotten or liquor-stained like the men she had dealt with before. She waited for him to touch her or speak of arrangements. He said nothing. They rode for over an hour before the land opened wider. The hills rose and fell in soft humps, dotted with mesquite and boulder clusters. She watched the sky flatten against the horizon and wondered how far he meant to take her. Hunger twisted her stomach, sharper now that the worst of the town was behind her. The cloth sack he'd given her rested across her lap. She could smell cornmeal and something dried inside, but she didn't dare open it yet. Isaac finally spoke when the creek came into view, a narrow line of moving water cutting through the rock bed. "We'll water the horse." His voice was level, neither kind nor cold, just stated like a fact. He swung down from his saddle and tied Flint to a low branch. Then he stepped back, waiting for her to climb down herself. She hesitated, expecting him to drag her off, but when he didn't move, she slid down on her own, landing unsteadily on her cracked feet. Pain shot through the soles, but she didn't make a sound. Isaac glanced once at her bare skin against the stones, but said nothing of it. He loosened the saddle cinch and let the horse drink. She stayed a few steps away, clutching the coat around her, unsure whether to follow or stay put. The creek water was clear enough to show stone and sand beneath its surface. She wanted to crouch and drink, to wash the grit off her face, but waited to see if he would allow it. Isaac filled his hands in the water and splashed his face once. Then he nodded to the creek in her direction. Drink if you need. He didn't gesture again or walk closer. His attention remained mostly on the horse, but he watched her from the corner of his eye, gauging whether she understood. She knelt carefully and dipped her hands into the cold water. She didn't gulp like an animal. She took slow mouthfuls, keeping her eyes on the edge of the bank in case he changed his mind. The water ran down her wrists and disappeared into the sleeves of his coat. When she finished, he handed her a strip of dried venison from his saddlebag. She stared at it, waiting for a price to be named. He just said, "Eat." His tone made it clear it wasn't a bargain. She took it reluctantly and chewed in small bites, keeping distance. Once Flint had drunk enough, Isaac packed the gear again. When he mounted, he didn't offer a hand, only waited until she climbed up behind him. This time, she gripped the back of his shirt instead of the saddle horn when the horse started moving. It wasn't trust, just necessity to stay on. The land around them rose slightly into a stretch of broken pasture and sparse trees. In the distance, a line of jagged rocks marked the edge of his property. He hadn't had a visitor in over a year, not even a trader or stray prospector. The last time a woman had crossed that threshold, she'd been his wife, and she'd been breathing. That memory sat buried, but the silence on the ride back made it rise in flashes he pushed down. She watched the unfinished part of his homestead appear slowly. The corral fence leaning from wind damage, the cabin built from uneven logs, the frame of a second room half finished, sawhorses still standing where a wall should be. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney this early in the day, but the ashes inside would still hold heat. When he stopped near the trough outside the cabin, he swung his leg over and climbed down. She stayed on the horse, unsure if she could step onto his land without being told. He untied the sack from the saddle and glanced up at her. "You can get down." She slid off and almost stumbled when her feet touched the packed dirt. One of the boards on the porch creaked in the wind. A chicken scurried around the corner of the cabin, scratching for feed. The air smelled of cold earth, animal musk, and something baked into the wood long ago. Isaac lifted the latch on the cabin door and pushed it open. "Go in." He didn't block the entrance, didn't force her ahead or hold her back. Inside, the space was small but solid. One bed against the far wall, a potbelly stove beside it, a table with 2 chairs, a trunk near the foot of the bed, and a pile of cutwood stacked in the corner. A rifle hung above the doorframe on metal hooks. The half-built addition could be seen through the open interior frame. Roof unfinished, walls unsealed against wind. She stepped in slowly, hugging the coat closer. She waited for him to shut the door and follow behind her with instructions or demands. Instead, he set the sack of provisions on the table and went to stoke the coals in the stove. He added kindling and worked the flint until a flame caught and smoke drifted up the chimney. She stood still near the door, unsure whether to remove the coat or keep it. She glanced at the bed, thinking he would tell her to lie down like had been promised to the town man. He kept his back to her, shifting coals with the poker. When he finally looked over, he said only, "Sit if you want. You're not being used here." His voice wasn't kind, but it held no threat. Her fingers clenched around the coat. She lowered her eyes and moved toward the table slowly, not sitting yet, unsure if the words meant what they sounded like. He pulled a tin cup from the shelf and filled it from a water jug, then set it down in front of the empty chair closest to her. He didn't wait for a thank you. Questions hung in the silence. What he wanted, why he had brought her, whether he expected her to leave when fed. She didn't ask. She didn't have enough English to shape the words without risking offense. Isaac watched her from the side of the table. He didn't know her name or where she'd come from. He hadn't decided what to do with her beyond making sure she wasn't left for the men in town. But he knew she wouldn't survive long out here alone, and the thought of sending her back to Red Hollow made his stomach tighten in a way he didn't like. Before either spoke again, he struck a match and lit the oil lamp on the table, even though there was still daylight outside. The room brightened enough that the gaunt lines in her face and the faint shake in her arms became clearer. She looked around the cabin like someone trying to understand the cost of stepping inside. Everything past that point would force decisions on both of them, just not with words yet. The stove heat spread slow through the cabin, pushing back the cold that clung to her skin, but she stayed near the table like moving too much might change his mind about letting her inside. Isaac took off his hat, set on a hook by the door, then went to fetch another log for the fire. He didn't ask her to speak, didn't push any questions at her, but the silence between them wasn't easy. It held the weight of whatever each of them wasn't ready to say. She finally lowered herself into the chair he'd left pulled out. The coat slid off one shoulder, exposing the torn strap of her dress and the bruising along her collarbone. She pulled it back up quickly, glancing at him to see if he'd been watching. He had noticed. He didn't pretend otherwise, but he didn't stare, and that unsettled her almost as much as the thought of being touched. He reached into the burlap sack and pulled out the bundle of dried meat and the pouch of cornmeal. From a shelf above the stove, he took a tin pot and filled it with water, setting it on the stovetop to heat. She watched every movement, waiting for the moment he'd remind her what she owed. He didn't. He only said, "You'll eat warm," as if it didn't need explaining. Her eyes moved around the room, searching for signs of someone else. Another woman, a child, belongings that didn't belong to a man alone. She saw a second cup on the shelf, a pair of worn boots near the trunk, and a folded blanket on the cot by the door. She didn't see any dresses, no comb, no sewing kit beyond a small roll of needles and thread near the table. That eased one worry and raised another. No one else was here, which meant no protection from him if he chose to take what others in town would have. She tested her voice without meaning to, the word barely above a whisper. "Why you take?" The English felt clumsy, but the question pressed worse staying inside. Isaac didn't answer right away. He stirred the pot with a wooden spoon once the water began to steam. He didn't look at her when he spoke. Didn't want to see them decide what to do with you. That wasn't the full answer, and she felt it. Her fingers curled around the edge of the coat. "You want later?" Her voice was quieter now, not from shyness, but from bracing for confirmation. He paused before setting the spoon down. "I'm not here to take payment. You eat. You sleep. That's it for now." The last words, "for now," made her chest tighten again. She didn't know if it meant he'd decide later or if it was just how he spoke. Trusting a man's tone had gotten her hurt before. He ladled hot water into a bowl and mixed in cornmeal until it thickened, then added pieces of meat. He set the bowl in front of her and placed a spoon beside it. No warning, no reminder of what she owed for it. Her hands hovered over the bowl, unsure if she should wait for him to eat first. When he turned back to the stove for his own share, she began to eat quickly, keeping the coat pulled tight around her with her other hand. The heat of the food stung her tongue, but she didn't stop. Isaac ate, standing up, leaning one hand on the counter. He didn't make conversation. He wasn't used to speaking while eating, not after years of silent meals alone. He had brought back laborers before, a drifter, a boy too sick to work, but not women. The last woman who had slept under his roof had died on the bed, now waiting behind him, and he didn't let his mind hold that memory long. While she ate, he stepped to the corner near the cot and pulled out a small crate. Inside were old hides, scraps of cloth, and a pair of leather moccasins he hadn't worn in years. He set them by the table. "For your feet," he said without looking at her. She paused mid-bite and looked at the shoes. They were worn but whole. "You give?" she asked, not hiding her disbelief. "They're no use sitting in a box." He didn't add more. After finishing the bowl, she set the spoon down carefully. Her eyes flicked between him and the door. She didn't ask if she could stay. She didn't know the word for it. So she waited. Isaac took the empty bowl and ran his thumb along the rim to check if she'd eaten at all, not because he doubted her, but because it told him how long it had been since she had real food. He rinsed it in the water bucket, then wiped it with the cleanest rag he had. "You'll wash after you rest," he said. "There's a basin behind the stove. I'll heat water later." She didn't nod, but she didn't panic at the mention of washing. She glanced at the bed, then at the cot by the door. He caught the look and answered before she had to ask. "You take the bed. I'll sleep there." He nodded toward the cot. Her breath caught, not out of relief exactly, but because she wasn't used to being considered in the equation. Most men put her on the floor or pulled her under them without asking. He walked to the door, opened it just enough to check the yard, then closed it again. Nobody followed us. But some in town remember your face now. That wasn't a threat, just truth spoken plainly. She finally whispered, "Name, Isaac." He paused, then answered, "Isaac Boone." She hesitated before speaking again. "Nieli." She said it quietly, as if the name belonged to someone she used to be. He nodded once. He had gone 2 days without speaking his own name before today. The cabin settled into silence, but it was different now. Less like a stranger's house, more like something suspended until the next decision. Outside, the wind shifted the dry brush near the corral. Inside, she finally slipped her bruised feet into the moccasins and pulled the coat back around her shoulders, waiting to see if rest meant safety or only a pause before something was taken from her again. Night settled without ceremony. Isaac stepped back outside before dark fully set in, needing to check the horse and close the chicken coop. The air dropped colder with each minute, and with his coat still on her shoulders, the wind cut straight through his shirt. He didn't take it back. He didn't ask. The woman, Nieli, watched from the doorway, unsure if stepping out without permission would be taken as running. He didn't tell her to stay inside, but habit kept her in the frame of the door, eyes following where he went. She scanned the land beyond the yard, expecting men to appear over the ridge or at the tree lean, the way they had done before. But nothing moved except the sway of brush and the horse shifting weight. She wondered how far town was now, how easily someone could track them. If men from Red Hollow remembered her, would they bother coming? And if they did, would this man, Isaac, stand in their way the same as he had earlier, or decide it wasn't worth trouble to keep her? Inside, she tested the floorboards with slow steps, memorizing the sound each one made. There were no locks on the inside of the door. The rifle above the frame remained untouched. She noticed the barrel was clean. She also noticed what was missing: no bottles, no cards, no spare boots by the door that belonged to someone else. One man lived here, alone. When he came back inside, he latched the door and lit the second oil lamp on the shelf. The shadows shifted into clearer shapes. He picked up the spare blanket from the cot and hesitated for the first time since bringing her here. He didn't know what else she needed. He didn't know what she expected. He only knew he wasn't putting her back in the cold. She moved first, testing something. "You been soldier?" Her English was broken, but her eyes were sharp. He didn't flinch at the question. Most avoided speaking of that part of his past. Years ago. He didn't add more. She looked at the scar on his neck. The shape of it, the pale ridge where the skin didn't heal flat. Enemy or your men? She asked it carefully, not to pry, but because knowing who cut him told her what kind of danger lived in his history. He met her eyes for a moment, steady but unreadable. Doesn't matter now. The edge in his tone warned off further digging, but not in anger, more in refusal to open wounds. She looked away after that. The fire in the stove clinked against the iron sides. She shifted her weight in the coat, and the bed caught her gaze again. She had slept in worse places, on dirt, in wagons under men. A mattress, even used, even cold, felt like something from another life. Isaac must have read some of her thoughts because he pointed to the wooden basin beside the stove. "I'll heat water. You can wash before sleep." He spoke plainly, not like he was doing her a favor or demanding anything in return. He filled the pot again and set it on the stove. She waited, unsure if removing the coat or loosening the torn dress would be taken as invitation. He turned his back to give her space and began unrolling his bedroll on the cot by the door. "You close eyes?" she asked, not wanting him watching if she undressed even a little. He didn't look up from the bedroll. "I'm not turning around unless the place catches fire." It wasn't a promise of modesty, but it was permission not to fear his gaze. When the water was hot enough, he poured it into the basin and stepped toward the back of the cabin to fetch a smaller cloth from a shelf. She waited until he set it down and returned to his cot before she moved. With her back to him, she slipped out of the coat and peeled the dress down far enough to wash the dirt from her skin. The bruises on her ribs and hip were dark and fresh. She moved slowly so she didn't tear the seams further. She dipped the cloth and scrubbed her arms, her neck, and her face. She kept one arm across her chest the whole time. Isaac kept his focus on rolling out his blanket and checking the door latch, but the sounds, water sloshing, the uneven breaths of someone trying not to show pain, forced old images forward. His wife washing her hands after mending a shirt, the sound of water dripping off her hair. The smell of lye soaped the last night she spoke. He pushed it back down until there was nothing left but the creak of floorboards and the snap of the stove fire. When she finished, she pulled his coat back on and left the torn dress in a pile near the basin. The coat swallowed most of her shape now, though the looseness showed how thin she'd become. "You want other clothes?" he asked, noticing the hesitation when she looked at the bed. She glanced at the trunk near the foot of it. "Woman here before?" The question was quiet but direct. He didn't pretend not to understand. "My wife. She's buried south of here." His voice didn't change tone when he said it. It was fact, not confession. Nayeli absorbed that in silence. No woman would return to reclaim the bed. That answered the unspoken question of who he might be saving the space for. He nodded toward the mattress. "Sleep. Door stays shut. No one comes here without me hearing them first." She stepped to the bed, cautious, testing each board like it might give way. The mattress sagged a little under her slight weight. She looked at him once more, not asking permission, but trying to read something final in his face. Isaac stretched out on the cot and pulled his blanket over his chest. The rifle above the door stayed within arm's reach. His eyes stayed open until she lay down fully. She didn't remove the coat. She curled on top of the blanket rather than under it, one hand tucked beneath her head, the other holding the collar closed. Exhaustion pulled at her harder than fear now. Her eyes closed slowly, ready to snap open if the floor creaked wrong. Isaac listened to her breathing settle into a rough rhythm. He stayed awake longer than necessary, not out of suspicion, but because the last time someone else slept under his roof, he'd lost them before dawn. He watched the dim glow of the oil lamp fade and the coals drop low in the stove. No footsteps came, no men from town, no knocking on the door. Just wind sliding against the boards and the sound of someone who hadn't slept safely in weeks, surrendering to rest against worn cotton and wool. He closed his eyes only when he was sure she wouldn't bolt before morning. The night passed without knocking, without bootsteps in the yard, without the creak of a hinge or the bark of a dog warning of strangers. When the first light pushed through the small window, the air inside the cabin still held the last of the stove's heat. Isaac opened his eyes before the sun cleared the ridge. Years of sleeping light made waking easy, even after a night with someone else in the room. He didn't sit up right away. He listened for movement, breathing, shifting weight, the sound of feet on the floor. Nayeli hadn't moved much in the night. Now, she stirred once, not startled, but slow, as if checking where she was before opening her eyes fully. The coat had slipped halfway down her shoulder. She adjusted it quietly, not wanting to draw attention. Isaac sat up on the cot and swung his legs over the side. She watched him from a bed, alert but not panicked. For a moment, neither spoke. He stood, stretched his back, and set the rifle on its hooks again. She glanced at the door, then the window, like measuring escape routes or checking if someone else might appear. He broke the silence first. "You hungry?" It wasn't a question. He moved to the stove and stirred the coals until flame caught again. The smell of ash lifted into the air. He poured water into the pot and reached for the cornmeal bag. She sat up, legs still covered by the coat, hair tangled around her face. She didn't ask permission to move this time. She stood and crossed the basin to wash the sleep from her hands and face. Isaac noticed her bare legs below the hem of the coat, skin marked with old bruises and dried cuts. He didn't look long. "Food will be ready soon," he said, turning his focus back to the pot. While the water heated, he stepped outside briefly to fetch wood. She moved to the door when it closed, not to follow him, but to listen for voices, gunfire, or the clatter of saddle rigs. Nothing came but the scrape of firewood and a chicken rustling in the dirt. When he returned, she was still by the door, arms crossed tight over the coat. He set the wood by the stove and nodded toward the table. "Sit." She hesitated, then obeyed, keeping her back to the wall this time instead of the room. He cooked in silence. When he set a bowl in front of her and another for himself, She waited to see if he'd speak of work, payment, or plans to take her back to town. Instead, he sat across from her and ate like it was any other morning. She tasted the food slower than last night, less afraid it would vanish before she finished. Still, her eyes lifted between bites, watching his hands, his face, his shoulders for changes in tone. When she spoke, it was cautious. "I work today." The words were careful, not wanting to sound ungrateful or assume she could stay. Isaac considered his answer. "There's wood to bring in, and the chickens need feeding. But you do only what you can. I didn't bring you here to use you up." The phrase, "use you up," landed heavy in her mind. It was too close to what had happened before. She set the spoon down and looked at him, trying to understand what he wanted if not that. "You take me. Why? Not woman? Not servant." He held her gaze a moment. "Didn't take you for what you could do for me. Took you so those men wouldn't decide what to make you do. That's all I knew then." He didn't try to make his choice sound noble. She absorbed the words in silence, then asked the next thing that mattered. "I stay or I go?" If he said go, she'd leave with the coat on her back and the food in her stomach, even if it meant dying 2 days later. "You stay for now. Nobody's coming for you here." He didn't tell her how long for now meant, because he hadn't decided himself. She picked up a spoon again. This time she ate the rest without rushing. When the bowls were empty, she gathered them and carried them to the basin without being asked. She rinsed them out with a steadier hand than the night before. Isaac left her to it and stepped outside to check the corral and the sky. No dust trails on the horizon suggested riders. No tracks near the yard hinted at anyone approaching. Red Hollow was far enough that news wouldn't travel fast unless someone there had a grudge strong enough to ride after them. He didn't think any of the men had enough backbone to follow him onto his land, but he kept watch anyway. Back inside, she stood near the table, unsure where to go next. He pointed to the moccasins he'd given her. "Try them on. Ground here tears feet worse than town." She sat and pulled them on, the leather soft but snug. They weren't a perfect fit, but better than bleeding barefoot through brush. He noticed the dress still crumpled near the basin. "I've got cloth and thread. You can mend that or use something from the trunk." His wife's old belongings were few. Some folded shirts, a torn skirt, a shawl, a small bag of buttons. He hadn't touched them in years. Offering them wasn't easy, but leaving her in rags was worse. She didn't reach for the trunk yet. "Your woman, gone long?" Her eyes flicked to the bed, then the window, trying to piece together what kind of man buries someone and lives this way. 3 winters. He didn't offer more. She didn't press. Outside the window, the wind rattled the half-built frame of the second room. Her eyes followed the sound. "You bill for child?" she asked, quiet but direct again. He looked at the unfinished wall and then at her. "Was building for one. Didn't finish." That was all he said. She nodded once, accepting it without pity. Loss was not foreign to her. She didn't speak of who she'd lost. He didn't ask. Isaac moved to the door and opened it. "If you're strong enough, help me bring in wood. If not, stay warm inside. Nobody's forcing you out there." Naeli stood, pulling the coat tighter and adjusting the moccasins. She stepped outside without asking, the cold biting less than the memory of being watched by town men. The distance from Red Hollow felt safer now that she'd seen no one else here. She followed him to the woodpile behind the cabin. He split logs while she gathered the smaller cuts and carried them back to the porch. She worked slow, gauging how much she could do without drawing his anger. He didn't hurry her. He didn't comment on how she carried the pieces or how many trips she made. He just kept splitting wood until there was enough for a week. At one point, she paused and looked at the road they'd come from. "Men come here sometimes?" Her voice was low, but the worry was clear. "Traders pass once a month. Neighbor 2 miles north. They don't come without cause," he said, keeping his eyes on the axe. "Anyone comes for you, I'll know why." She held on to that answer like something she could test later. For now, it was enough to keep working. By midday, the silence between them had changed. They still said little, but the air no longer felt like a hell breath. He showed her where the chicken feed was stored. She scattered grain with careful steps while the birds clucked around her ankles. He checked Flint's hooves and refilled the trough. When she returned to the porch, he asked his first question about her past. Not to pry, but because it needed answering. Anyone looking for you? If danger followed her, he needed to know how close. She weighed the question, then shook her head once. Only men want use. No family come. No tribe come. There was finality in her tone. He accepted that. For the first time since picking up the broken sign in the street, he understood she had nowhere else to go. They went back inside when the air turned sharper. She set another log on the fire without being told. He ladled water into the pot again. Neither spoke of tomorrow yet, but both knew they would still be here when it came. By late afternoon, clouds gathered low over the ridge, and the temperature dropped fast enough to warn of a coming windstorm. Isaac brought in the last armful of split wood and stacked it near the stove while Nayeli folded the coat tighter around herself and fed the fire until the iron belly glowed a dull red. Working side by side without speaking had settled into something that didn't scrape the nerves anymore. But small things still made her pause, like when he reached over her shoulder to grab the poker and she drew back before realizing he wasn't trying to touch her. The flinch wasn't loud, but he saw it. He didn't comment, just stepped back and gave her space. He pointed to the trunk at the foot of the bed. There are clothes in there. Some may fit. You don't have to wear that dress another night. She stayed crouched by the stove for a few seconds before standing and crossing to the trunk. She lifted the lid slowly, as if expecting something to jump out or a reprimand to follow. Inside were a folded skirt, an undershirt, a wool shawl, a faded blue blouse, and a bundle of linens. She didn't touch everything, just laid her hand on the skirt and blouse long enough to understand the fabric. "These hers?" she asked, not accusing, but aware of the weight behind the question. "Some," he said. "Some were meant for when the baby came. Never used." He said it plainly, not with softness. She kept her eyes on the clothes and didn't say she was sorry. She knew sorrow didn't fix anything. Instead, she chose the blouse and skirt, both slightly too big, but clean and whole. She folded them over one arm. "I wash in basin first," she said. She didn't want to put new clothes on while still wearing dirt and someone else's scent. He nodded once and went outside to draw more water from the barrel. When he returned, he set the bucket beside the door and knelt to remove the lid. "You can warm it before washing. There's soap on the shelf by the kettle." She waited for him to step back before taking the bucket and pouring water into the basin. The floorboards didn't creak as much this time when she moved. She stripped the torn dress and laid it flat near the hearth, then washed quickly, careful not to splash or leave the water too dirty for reuse. She scrubbed the grime from her arms, legs, and neck, and winced when the cloth passed over fresh bruises. Isaac sat at the table, whittling a piece of dry wood to keep his hands occupied instead of staring. He didn't turn around, but he didn't pretend not to hear the water, the soft hiss of breath when pain flared, the rustle of fabric being lifted and dried. The quiet made room for memory whether he wanted it or not. His wife humming once while brushing her hair at that same basin, her hand on her lower belly the last week before the fever took her. When Nayeli finished washing and dressed in the skirt and blouse, she stood near the bed and pulled the coat back over herself, though the clothes covered more than anything she'd worn in weeks. The fabric hung a bit loose at the waist and chest, and the sleeves came almost to her knuckles. She smoothed them down anyway, adjusting the collar so it wasn't choking her throat. Isaac looked up when she approached the table for the empty bowls. He took her in with one glance. Not a stare, not a scan, just enough to note the difference. He didn't tell her she looked better. He didn't comment at all. He only said, "Better than freezing in rags." And that was as close to approval as he gave. She gathered the torn dress from the floor and held it up by the worst seam. "I fixed this. Tomorrow." She wasn't asking to keep it. She was stating what needed doing. "There's thread and needle on the shelf," he said. "Use the chair by the window. Light's better." She nodded once and folded the dress over the back of the chair. The tension in her shoulders had shifted since coming here, still present, but not as sharp-edged. She moved around the cabin now, like someone who expected to be stopped but hadn't been yet. That evening, while the wind rose and rattled the partially built frame of the second room, Isaac checked the shutters and braced the door with the spare beam he kept behind it. He set a second log on the fire and cleaned the knife he'd used earlier to cut the meat. Nayeli sat at the table with the needle and thread, repairing a sleeve first, then the ripped side. She worked with precise stitches, fingers steady despite the fading light. He noticed something then. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Last night, they trembled when she held the spoon. Now, they moved with control, even when the needle pricked her thumb and drew a small bead of blood. She wiped it on the cloth and kept sewing. An unspoken question still hung in the air. Would anyone come from Red Hollow asking why a woman who held a sign in the street vanished with him? To address that gap, Isaac spoke before the thought could turn to worry in her eyes. Men in town don't ride far unless paid, and no one would admit losing you. They have to own what they were doing. She absorbed that, eyes fixed on the fabric in her lap. But maybe they remember your face, she said quietly. They remembered it before, he answered, still kept their distance. That response filled the silence with something she couldn't name. Maybe not safety, but something close enough to keep breathing evenly. Later, he handed her a wool blanket from the trunk and another to keep on the bed. She didn't ask if he wanted the coat back. He didn't ask either. She kept it on when she climbed into the bed again, this time sliding under the top blanket instead of lying on top of it. He settled onto the cot, boots off but trousers still on, same as the night before. The rifle stayed where he could reach it without standing. She shifted once and spoke without looking at him. You think I leave when food gone? It wasn't a complaint, just a fear they both knew was there. He answered without turning. You leave when you choose, or if you make it unsafe here. Not before. That answer wasn't gentle, but it wasn't a dismissal. She closed her eyes after that and didn't ask anything else. In the dark, Isaac stayed awake long enough to hear the wind batter the walls and the unfinished roof beam groan. He thought of asking her more about how she ended up in town, whether someone sold her off or if her own people cast her out. But questions could wait. The only thing that mattered tonight was that the door was barred, the fire still alive, and no one was close enough to break either. When he finally slept, it wasn't the sleep of a man alone anymore, but not yet the sleep of someone unguarded. And across the room, the woman who came expecting to trade herself for a meal rested with both eyes shut for the first time in weeks. By morning, the wind had calmed, but the sky stayed low and colorless. The cabin walls held the warmth from the night fire, and the air inside was still enough that Nayeli didn't wake in a panic the second her eyes opened. She lay still for a moment, listening, not for shouting, boots, or the rattle of a doorknob, but for movement that might mean expectations. Instead, she heard only wood shifting in the stove and Isaac adjusting something on the table. She sat up slowly, the wool blanket slipping down her waist. The coat was still around her shoulders, and she pulled it tighter before standing. He didn't look at her like she'd done something wrong by sleeping late. He was pouring water into the pot already, sleeves rolled, not watching her every move like most men did with a woman in their space. She checked the torn dress she'd mended and folded it neatly before setting it on the trunk. The borrowed blouse and skirt fit better now that she'd tightened the waist with a strip of cloth. She wore the moccasins again without needing to be told. Isaac glanced at the door before he spoke. Wind knocked down part of the fence behind the corral. I'll fix it before noon. You stay close to the cabin. She studied his face, then asked the question she'd held back since the night before. If men come, you tell them what? Her English was improving, but the meaning carried something deeper. Do you send me out or stand in front of me? He didn't take offense at it. Depends who comes and why. Nobody's taking you off this land without going through me first. That was the first time he said it plain, not in hints or silence. She didn't thank him. Gratitude had been used against her before, but something in her shoulders settled enough to be seen. He split the last of the cold ash in the stove and added a fresh log. She stepped forward before he could reach for the water pail and said, I make breakfast. She didn't ask if she was allowed. She said it like a job that needed doing, and she was there to do it. He stepped aside and let her take the spoon and kettle. She moved slower than someone well-fed, but with more certainty than the day before. He didn't hover. He took his hat from the hook and checked the rifle once before setting it back in reach. As the water heated, she placed meat and cornmeal the way she'd watched him do it, copying his rhythm without needing instruction. At the table, he sharpened a knife and watched the window for dust trails. She paused once with the spoon in her hand and asked the other question people in town would wonder. You tell them I am wife? Or nothing? He wiped the blade on a cloth and met her eyes. If someone from town rides out here, I'll tell them what keeps them from asking more. If calling you my wife keeps them off you, that's what I'll say. She absorbed that in silence. She tested it before speaking. You say that you want that? Or only words? It mattered, whether she was being covered or claimed. He didn't look away. You're not here to be used or sent back. That's as far as I've decided. He didn't promise more, but he didn't leave it open for someone else to claim her either. She turned back to the stove and stirred the pot. Her heartbeat wasn't loud in her ears like before. The silence between them had changed again, not to comfort, but to something that didn't scrape like raw nerves. When the bowls were set on the table, she sat across from him without waiting for an invitation. They ate without rush. The food went down easier today. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and said something she hadn't been able to say since they left town. You not want me for body. Why you look at me then? Her tone was steady, not accusing. She needed to know where eyes ended and hands might follow. Isaac didn't pretend confusion. You're here. I see you. Looking doesn't mean taking. He let the words stand. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she would have dared with anyone else. Then she stood and gathered the bowls. He rose and went to the door. Fence won't fix itself. If you're strong enough to come outside, come. If not, stay by the fire. She followed him out without a word. The land beyond the cabin was quiet. Only the cold wind pushing across dry grass and the groan of the loose plank near the corral. The fence post had tilted where the earth softened from last week's rain. Isaac set down his tools and knelt to check the base. Nayeli crouched beside the fallen rail and held it steady without being asked. While working, she asked the question she hadn't dared in town. You have people? Family? Brother? Someone come here sometimes. He didn't pause in his work. No, had a brother once. He's buried east of here. Had parents, gone before the war. Wife and boy gone too. No dramatics. Just straight, stripped truth. She nodded once, eyes lowered but ears open. Then no woman come and say, I must leave. His voice stayed level. No woman coming to take your place if that's what you're asking. That answer covered what needed covering. She shifted the plank so he could hammer the rail back into place. He noticed her pace, her strength, the way she adjusted her hands to avoid splitting the wood. She wasn't useless, and she wasn't delicate in the way town men thought. When they finished, he stood and looked toward the ridge line again. I don't plan to take you back to Red Hollow, but if you ever want to leave, you say it before you walk away. I won't track you unless danger follows behind you. She processed that with care. If danger follow, you still stop it? Her voice carried less fear now and more assessment. He answered with the same calm weight he used at the trading post. If someone comes for you, they meet me first. No promise of affection, no apology. Just clear ground. They walked back to the cabin with the tools. A hawk circled high above the valley. The land stretched wide and empty enough to swallow whole the memory of the sign she held in the street. Inside, the fire crackled and the coat hung off her shoulders like it had always belonged there. For the first time since stepping onto his land, she closed the door behind them without looking back at the road. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge that evening, the wind had died down completely, leaving the land still and colorless. Isaac brought in the last bucket of water from the barrel and set it near the stove. Nayeli had already laid the mended dress over a chair and folded the leftover cloth and thread. The room didn't feel as temporary as when she first stepped into it. Her things no longer looked borrowed, just placed. She lit the oil lamp without being told. The first nights, she waited for his permission, checking if flame was allowed, if light in the dark drew attention. Now she struck the match and shielded it with her hand the same way she'd seen him do. He wiped the dirt from his hands with a rag and set his tools on the shelf. The silence wasn't as sharp now, but there was still distance in it. Not distrust, just caution trimmed down to its cleanest shape. As she stirred the pot over the stove, she asked quietly, In Red Hollow, men know you fight before? Her memory of the looks they gave him when he took the sign from her hadn't faded. Isaac didn't pretend he'd always been left alone. They've seen what I do when cornered. Word keeps most of them from trying. She watched the way his jaw moved when he said it. You kill. The question wasn't out of fear, it was calculation. What a man had done before told her what he might do again. I have, he said. Not for sport. Not for pay. But I don't lose sleep ending something that needs ending. She nodded once and turned back to the pot. That answer was enough. When she served the food, she didn't wait for him to sit first. He watched her eat and noticed the change. She no longer counted the bites left in the bowl or glanced at the door between mouthfuls. After they finished, she wiped the bowls and set them to dry. He checked the windows and the half-built frame of the second room for loose boards. The roof over that side still needed finishing, and he had thought more than once about abandoning the project altogether. But now, with another person in the cabin, leaving things half done left room for more risk. She noticed him looking at the frame. You finished that room? She asked, stepping closer. Not like a guest, but someone assessing the space she might live in. If the roof holds through winter, I'll finish it come spring, he said. Then after a moment, added, could be yours if you need a place separate. She looked at the open frame a long while, imagining walls and a door that shut. Then she asked the thing she hadn't dared the first days. You think I run? Take coat, leave you. He answered without offense. I thought you might the first night. Not now. But if you did, I wouldn't chase you unless someone else was behind you. The honesty startled her, not because she doubted it, but because most men lied before they held you still. She took a breath and said something she hadn't voiced since before Red Hollow. I left people. My choice. Not stolen. Not sold. She rarely offered pieces of herself without being forced, but this one mattered. Isaac leaned against the support beam of the unfinished frame and listened. She didn't look at him while speaking. My tribe pushed me out when I would not take a man, they said. I wanted traders, then miners. Then her eyes dropped to the floor. Town. He didn't fill the silence with pity or judgment. Nobody coming after you to claim you back? No, she said. Then, after a pause, but some men remember things that should die in the dust. He understood that more than he said. Anybody laid claim to you before that town saw you? She lifted her chin the slightest bit. No man owned me. I do what I must, but I was no one's wife. No man paid for that right. He respected that answer by not twisting it. Then nobody has a say but you in where you stay now. They stood that way a while, each leaning into what truth let them keep. Eventually, she asked the things still left open. If men come and ask who I am, you tell them wife. Then I must be that for real. He stepped closer, stopping a safe distance away. A word at the door doesn't bind you to a bed. Calling you wife keeps rifles down and hands off. Only becomes real if you choose it. She looked at him then, not with fear, but with calculation and something like relief. If I choose one day, you take that. The question hung between them as a test, not a promise. He didn't blink. If you choose it, I take it. Not before. That settled another crack in the uncertainty. When night came fully, she didn't wait for him to suggest sleep. She placed another log in the stove and checked that the door bar was set. When she climbed into the bed this time, she didn't keep the coat on. She folded it at the foot and lay under the wool blanket, her hair loose against the pillow. Isaac sat on the cot, unbuttoning his shirt halfway before pulling the blanket over himself. He didn't watch her settle. She didn't watch him lie down. But the last thing she said before closing her eyes answered a question he hadn't asked yet. My name mean I am loved, but no one called me it right. Too long, they said. Too much. She spoke it without shaking this time. He didn't say her name back, but he held it in his mind without cutting it short. The lamp was blown out. The coals in the stove popped once then settled. For the first time, the night did not feel like something closing in, but something holding still until morning. Morning broke without wind and without the threat of footsteps on the road. The air held a bite, but not enough to keep either of them from stepping outside when the sun crept over the ridge. Isaac checked the trough, the chicken coop, and the fencing they'd repaired the day before. Nayeli gathered the folded dress she'd mended and laid it across the chair to finish stitching a hem she'd missed. There was no rush in her movements, no glance at the door like she might be dragged out at any moment. After breakfast, Isaac saddled Flint. He didn't tell her to stay inside, just said, go to check the south edge of the pasture. Be back before noon. She stood on the porch and watched him ride out, coat sleeves hanging past her wrists in the cold air. He didn't look back, not because he didn't care if she was gone when he returned, but because he didn't believe she would run. While he was gone, she moved through the cabin with a different kind of care. Not sneaking, not hiding, just taking stock. She searched the trunk and found a small tin box with buttons and thread. She set it aside without opening it, respecting what wasn't hers. She knelt by the hearth and stirred the cooled ash before placing fresh kindling. The stove took the flame on the first try. She brought in wood without waiting to be asked and poured water from the bucket into the basin to soak the cloth she'd set aside to wash. When Isaac returned, Flint's hooves crunching over the packed dirt, she was outside patching a tear in one of his work shirts, her back against the cabin wall. The sight made him pause before dismounting. He didn't speak for a moment, just watched the way she held the needle and the quiet focus in her shoulders. "Anything out there?" she asked, eyes still on the shirt. "Nothing but Elk's sign," he said. He tied Flint and loosened the saddle straps. "You had any visitors?" She shook her head. "Only hen try come in the door." She pointed to a chicken pecking near the porch. He huffed once through his nose, a sound close to a laugh but quiet enough not to startle her. She's been trying that since last winter. They went back inside where the warmth had taken hold. Isaac emptied the small game sack, 2 rabbits and a quail. Naomi got up without prompting and set a pot on the stove. He watched her handle the knife with practiced care, not flinching at the blood. As she worked, she asked the question that lingered since he'd spoken of calling her wife if men from town came. "When someone asks, you say I belong here. That true now, or only when danger come?" He met the question head on. "You're not here because I need a warm body or a cook. You're here because you chose not to walk away yesterday or the day before. If you stay, it's because this place belongs to both of us now. Not just me." She studied his face, looking for cracks in the words, old lies, the kind of false comfort men used when they wanted something. She didn't find any. She set the knife down and wiped her hands clean. "Then I stay. Not for food. Not because I cannot walk. I stay because no one come here to buy me, and you not push me out when they don't pay." He nodded once, accepting her terms. "Then if anyone asks, I'll say what keeps them from circling. And I won't use the word wife unless you're ready for it." She stepped closer, close enough for him to see where her hair brushed her collar and where the sleeves hung uneven on her arms. "What if I'm ready before you ask?" There was no fear in the question, only clarity. His jaw shifted, not with nerves but with a decision made without delay. "Then you don't have to wait for me to speak it first." They stood that way, no rush, no script. She rested her hand lightly on his forearm, not to offer herself, not to test him, but to mark what had been decided. He didn't grab her or pull away. He placed his hand over hers for the first time since he'd touched her shoulder in town. She didn't tremble. Later, when the stew simmered and the light began to fade, she brushed her hair with her fingers and asked, "You sleep on cot still?" He looked at the bed, then at her. "I've been staying there because you needed space. If that's different now, you tell me." She didn't look away. Different now. There was no rush toward one another, no desperate reaching. He waited for her to move first, and she did, slow, certain, not in fear. She sat on the bed and unbuttoned the top of the blouse, not to offer her body, but to show she wasn't hiding from him anymore. He sat beside her and didn't touch until she closed the space herself, her hand at the edge of his jaw, her forehead leaning against his after a quiet moment. Their first kiss wasn't hungry or clumsy. It was deliberate and steady, like sealing something already agreed to. His hand rested at the back of her neck, but he didn't pull. She parted from him when she was ready and leaned her head against his shoulder. They lay down later with the lamp blown out and the coat folded at the foot of the bed. She tucked herself beneath the blanket and rested her hand on his chest. He stayed awake long enough to feel the difference in her breathing. No sharp catches, no waiting for a blow. Before sleep settled, she said the words she hadn't dared in town, spoken into the darkness without shame. "No one take me now. Not while I stay with you." Isaac answered without hesitation. "No one will." Outside, the world was still. No riders came down the road. No faces peered through the windows. The past stayed where it belonged, in distant dust and dead men's memories. And in that one-room cabin, with an unfinished wall and a man who didn't ask for what he couldn't return, Nayeli stopped being a woman trying not to starve and started being someone who wasn't leaving.